The letter of reference was 3 lines long, and every word in it was a lie. Miss Nell Farrow, lately in service to a family in Kent, is honest, capable, and well suited to the care of an elderly lady. She comes with my complete confidence. There was no family in Kent. There was no one whose confidence she carried, except her own, and even that had worn thin as paper by the time the carriage turned in through the gates of Alderleigh Hall. And she saw, through the fogged glass, the long avenue of limes she had once counted from a nursery window, one by one, until she fell asleep. She did not let her face change. She had practiced not letting her face change for the better part of a year, in front of a cracked mirror in a rented room above a chandler's shop, until the girl who flinched at everything had gone somewhere else and left behind a woman who did not. The house came into view the way it always had, all at once, past the last bend in the drive, gray stone gone gold at the edges where the late afternoon sun struck it, 14 chimneys, a stone dog on the east terrace with its nose worn smooth by 200 years of children's hands, her own included. She had been born in that house. She had been carried out of it in the dark, 11 years old, wrapped in a coachman's coat, because there had been no time to fetch her own, and told by a man she had trusted that her father was dead, her home was sold, and she was going to live with distant relations who would explain everything when she was older. They had never explained anything. They had, in time, stopped answering her letters at all. She was 26 now, and she had come back to Alderleigh Hall as a stranger to work for the man who had bought it, in order to find the one thing that might prove she had any right to the name she no longer used. The carriage stopped. A footman she did not recognize opened the door. She stepped down, smoothed the gray wool of a dress that was not fashionable and had never been meant to be, and walked up the steps of her own house as though she had never climbed them before. The housekeeper who received her at the door was not the housekeeper Nell remembered. That woman, kind and broad and smelling perpetually of beeswax, had died the winter after Nell left, or so a solicitor's letter had informed her years later, in the same flat sentence that informed her of a great many other things she had not been permitted to grieve properly. This housekeeper was younger, sharp-eyed, dressed in unrelieved black, and introduced herself as Mrs. Selby with the particular briskness of a woman who had a great deal to do and very little patience for anyone who might slow her down. "You're the new companion for her ladyship," Mrs. Selby said. It was not a question. "Yes, she's difficult," Mrs. Selby said, not unkindly, simply as a fact to be filed. "Lady Osgood, I mean, His Grace's aunt. She's been poorly since the spring, and she does not care for being read to. And she does not care for being asked how she's feeling, and she does not care, above all, for young women who cry." "Do you cry, Miss Farrow?" "Not where anyone can see," Nell said, and meant it more than Mrs. Selby could have known. Something in the housekeeper's face eased a fraction, as if this answer had been the correct one. "Come in, then. His Grace is not receiving today. You'll meet him at dinner, if her ladyship is well enough to come down, and if she isn't, you'll meet him tomorrow, or possibly not at all for a week, as he keeps to the estate office when the mood takes him. He is not a man who wastes conversation." Nell followed her through the front hall, past the wide curved staircase, and stopped, for the length of one breath, at the foot of it. There, on the landing, exactly where it had always hung, was the portrait of a girl of perhaps 7 in a blue dress, standing in the rose garden, with a hand raised to shade her eyes against a painted sun. She had forgotten. She still knew how to hold her breath so completely that no one could hear it leave her. "His Grace kept the old pictures," Mrs. Selby said, following her gaze without any particular interest. "Said it wasn't his business to strip a house of its history just because he'd bought it. Sentimental, for a man who otherwise hasn't a sentimental bone in him. This way, Miss Farrow." The room she was given was in the old servants' wing, small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. It was not the room that had once been hers. That room, she knew without asking, would be somewhere in the family wing now, behind a door she had no business opening. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap in the exact posture Mrs. Selby had first found her in downstairs, and reminded herself, in the silence, of the three things she had come to do. Find the letter her father had written before he died, the one her old nurse had sworn existed and sworn she had hidden, the one that would say, in his own hand, what had truly become of his daughter and his fortune. Find proof, if proof still existed, of what her cousin had done, and do both of these things without anyone in this house discovering that the new companion already knew every creak in every floorboard, because she had grown up listening for them in the dark. She was not, by nature, a woman who prayed, but she found herself, that first night at Alderleigh Hall, asking whatever might be listening for a little more time than she likely had. Lady Osgood turned out to be exactly as advertised, and, in Nell's private estimation, rather better company than advertised, once one learned not to flinch at her opening remarks. She was 71, sharp as a needle, propped permanently in a chair by the window of her sitting room, with a shawl she claimed to need, and a stack of correspondence she claimed to despise and answered daily, regardless. "You don't fuss," she informed Nell on the second morning, after watching her arrange a tea tray without asking a single unnecessary question. The last one fussed, asked if I was warm enough 4 times in an hour. I told her I was 71, not an infant, and she cried, and I had to comfort her, which entirely defeated the purpose of hiring a companion in the first place. "I won't ask if you're warm enough," Nell said. "I'll simply put another log on if you look cold." "Better," said Lady Osgood, with satisfaction, and from that morning on treated her with the particular gruff fondness of a woman who had decided, on evidence, that someone could be trusted not to waste her time. It was through Lady Osgood, in the slow, unspooling way of a woman with nothing to do but talk, and a great deal of history to talk about, that Nell learned the shape of the household she had returned to. The Duke, Alistair Blackwood, 6th of that name, to hold the title of Rivenhall, though the title itself had nothing to do with Alderleigh, which he had purchased outright 3 years past, had bought the estate at a time when, by Lady Osgood's account, he had wanted nothing so much as somewhere no one would find him. He was at sea a long while, she said, one afternoon, watching the garden with the particular squint of someone whose eyes were not what they had been, not the Navy, the East India trade, if you can credit a Duke's heir mucking about in trade. But his father disowned the notion of him inheriting anything at all for the better part of a decade, so my nephew went and made his own fortune out of spite, more or less, and came home only when the old Duke finally died, and there was no one left to disapprove of him. He does not care for society. He does not care for London. He bought this house because it was quiet, and because—" she paused, considering, "because I think it reminded him of somewhere he'd wanted, once, and never had." "Does he know its history?" Nell asked, as carefully as she could manage. "The family who had it before, some of it. Enough to know there was a scandal, and not enough to care about the particulars. There was a daughter, I believe, vanished or died or was sent away. Nobody was ever entirely clear, and the man who sold him the place was not inclined to elaborate." Lady Osgood turned her sharp old eyes on Nell, and for one terrible instant Nell was certain she had been seen through entirely. "Why do you ask, Miss Farrow?" "I only wondered," Nell said, "what it is to live in a house that was once someone else's whole world." Lady Osgood was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is a strange thing for a companion to wonder, but not, I think, a foolish one." She met the Duke properly 3 days later, in the library, where she had gone at dusk to find a book Lady Osgood had asked for, and had not expected to find anyone else there at all. He was standing at the tall windows with his back to the door, a man perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders in the manner of someone whose strength had been earned by labor rather than idleness, his dark coat plain and well-worn rather than fashionable. He did not turn immediately when she entered, and she had a moment, unguarded, to look at the room itself, her father's library, every shelf exactly as she remembered it, the same green curtains, the same worn patch on the rug before the hearth where she had once spilled an inkpot and been forgiven for it, before he spoke. "You're the new companion," he said, without turning. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned, somewhere, that silence rarely cost him anything. "Pharaoh, yes, Your Grace." He turned then and studied her with a directness that most gentlemen of her acquaintance, what little acquaintance remained to her, would have considered impolite. She held still under it, the way she had learned to hold still under Mrs. Selby's assessing looks, under the innkeeper's suspicious ones, under a year of scrutiny from people who might at any moment decide she did not belong wherever she currently stood. "You know the house," he said at last. Her pulse did something complicated. "I've only been here 3 days, Your Grace." "That isn't what I asked." He nodded toward the shelf beside her, where her hand, without her quite noticing, had gone directly to the third book from the left on the second shelf, a small, plain volume of poetry that had been her mother's, that she could have found blindfolded, that had absolutely no reason to be memorable to a stranger newly arrived in service. "You went straight to it. Most people search a library. You didn't search." Nell's fingers curled slightly against the spine of the book. "I have a good eye for where things are kept, Your Grace. It's a useful quality in service." He considered this. She could not tell from his face whether he believed her or whether he had simply decided, for reasons of his own, not to press the matter further. "Lady Osgood speaks well of you," he said instead. "She does not speak well of most people. You should know that counts for something in this house." "I'll try to deserve it," Nell said, and took her book and left before he could look at her hands again, which had not entirely stopped trembling. It went on like that for the better part of a fortnight. Small collisions between what she knew and what she was permitted to know, each one a narrow escape. She could not quite believe she had survived. She knew the dog's name before anyone told her. The old groundskeeper's spaniel, gray-muzzled now, answered to Wren, and she had called him that without thinking, on the second week, and caught herself only after he came bounding to her across the stable yard, as if he too remembered something he had no right to remember. She knew which stair creaked and stepped over it out of habit rather than instruction. Once, humming without noticing, she caught Mrs. Selby watching her with an intent she could not read, and the housekeeper said nothing, only turned back to her ledgers. But from that day on, there was a new quality to the way she looked at Nell. Not suspicion exactly, but attention, the attention of someone doing sums that did not yet add up. The Duke, for his part, seemed to be conducting a quieter version of the same arithmetic. He was not a talkative man, but he was, she came to understand, a watchful one. And twice more in that fortnight she found his gaze on her at odd moments. Once, when she corrected a footman's account of which wing had housed the old nursery, as though she had simply known and forgotten she oughtn't. Once, when, walking the grounds with Lady Osgood's shawl forgotten on her arm, she took the path to the rose garden without glancing at a signpost, though the garden lay a full quarter-mile from the house and around 2 turnings she ought not to have guessed at. She began to be more careful. It did not entirely help. It was in the 4th week that Josiah Crane came to Alderleigh Hall, and the ground under Nell's careful new life shifted like something long unsteady finally giving way. She was in the hall when the carriage arrived, on an errand for Lady Osgood, and she recognized the crest on its door before she recognized the man who stepped out of it. because the crest had once briefly been affixed to letters she had received as a girl, letters full of comfort and reassurance, in the months after her father's death, from the cousin who had been named her guardian, and who had promised, in ink she had believed entirely, to protect what was hers until she came of age. Josiah Crane had aged into a comfortable, well-fed sort of respectability. He wore his prosperity easily, the way men do when they have never once had to account for how they came by it. He did not look at Nell at all as he crossed the hall. Why would he? Companions were furniture, and she had made very sure, in a year of careful practice, to move like furniture when it suited her. But she felt the whole of her carefully built composure narrow down to the single cold point of not being seen. "Mr. Crane," the Duke said, coming down the stairs with an expression that suggested this visit had not been anticipated with any particular pleasure. "I confess I did not expect you." "A small matter of business, Your Grace. Nothing that need trouble you long." Crane's smile was the smile she remembered from childhood, warm on the surface and entirely without weight beneath it. "There are still 1 or 2 questions outstanding regarding the settlement of the old estate. Nothing that touches your ownership, I assure you, merely tidying old paperwork. My late cousin's affairs were never quite so orderly as one might wish." "Your late cousin," the Duke repeated, with the flat patience of a man storing information for later use, "being the previous owner." "The Earl, yes. Alderleigh's title died with him. No male heir, you understand, and the estate itself unentailed, which was how I came to have the settling of it. Sad business. There was a daughter, but," Crane's gesture was small, dismissive, practiced. "She did not survive him long, a fever the winter after. These old houses breed illness in the damp months. I've always thought it a mercy she never had to see the place change hands." Nell stood 3 yards away with a shawl over her arm and did not by any visible measure react at all. Inside, something that had been cold for a very long time turned, all at once, to something else. He had told the world she was dead. She understood, standing there, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so long spent merely surviving, precisely what she had returned to Alderleigh Hall to do. It was no longer only about a letter hidden somewhere in a house too large to search safely. It was about a lie that had stood undisturbed for 15 years because the one person who could contradict it had been sent away too young, too frightened, and too thoroughly disbelieved to ever raise her voice against it. She went that night to the old nursery, using the back stair Mrs. Selby did not know she knew, and stood for a long while in the small cold room where, on the morning she had been taken away, her old nurse Hannah had pressed something into her hands and told her, in a whisper, to keep it safe and tell no one, and she, 11 years old and terrified, had lost it, or thought she had lost it, somewhere in the chaos of that leaving, and had spent 15 years believing whatever proof there had ever been was gone with it. But Hannah had not been a careless woman. Hannah had raised 3 generations of Alderleigh children, and had buried a husband and 2 sons of her own, and had not, Nell now understood with a strange lucidity of hindsight, been the sort of woman to entrust a single fragile secret to the shaking hands of a frightened child without also, quietly, making certain of it elsewhere. She remembered, with the sudden vividness of a door swinging open, a hiding place that had nothing to do with what she had carried that night, a loose panel behind the nursery bookshelf, where she and Hannah had once hidden small treasures together as a game, years before any of it mattered. She had not thought of it in 15 years. She thought of it now with her whole body. The panel gave under her fingers with a small, tired groan, as though it too had been waiting. Inside was a tin box, rusted at the corners, and inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, was a letter in her father's hand, dated the week before his death, addressed to no one in particular and everyone who might one day need it. A letter naming his daughter Eleanor Winslow his sole heir, describing in careful, damning detail his growing suspicion that his cousin Josiah Crane was manipulating the estate's accounts, and instructing that, should anything happen to him before the matter could be properly settled, this letter be treated as his true wishes above any document Crane might later produce. Beneath it, in a different, more hurried hand, was a second sheet, Hannah's own testimony, written some months after, describing what she had seen in the days after the Earl's death. Papers altered. A will produced that Hannah swore she had never once seen the old Earl sign, and a girl sent away in the night before anyone with authority to stop it could be found. Nell sat on the nursery floor with both letters in her lap and did not move for a long time. She did not hear the door. "You found something," said Josiah Crane from the doorway, and his voice had none of the warmth it had worn in the hall that afternoon. She got to her feet slowly, the letters pressed against her, and for the first time in 15 years let him look at her properly. Let him see the shape of a face he had known as a child, grown into the face of a woman he had told the world was dead. Whatever color had been in his face went out of it. "Eleanor," he said, and it was not a question, and it was the first time in 15 years anyone had said her true name aloud in that house. "You told them I was dead. You should have stayed dead," he said, and there was nothing of the comfortable, prosperous man from the hall left in his voice at all, only something cornered and afraid and therefore dangerous. "Do you understand what you've cost me, coming back here? What did you think would happen, that you'd walk into a stranger's house under a false name and simply take back what's mine? It was never yours." Her voice did not shake. She had spent a year making certain it would not shake for precisely this moment, though she had not known until now that she had been preparing for it all along. "You forged a will. You told a child her father was dead and her home was sold, and never once told her the truth was worse than either. You told the world I died of a fever so no one would ever come looking." He moved toward her. Not a large movement, but enough in the small, cold room to close the distance between them faster than she liked, and reached for the letters in her hands with the flat, ugly urgency of a man who had stopped thinking and started only reacting. "Give them to me." "No." His hand closed hard around her wrist, and for one long, frightening moment the 11-year-old girl who had been carried out of this house in the dark rose up in her all at once, and she understood with a kind of despairing clarity how easily this could still end the way he wanted it to end, alone, in a nursery no one else knew she was in. "Let her go." The Duke's voice came from the doorway, quiet and entirely without doubt. Nell would think afterward that she had never in her life been so glad to hear so few words spoken so plainly. Josiah Crane's hand fell away from her wrist as though it had been burned. "Your Grace, this is a family matter, nothing that concerns." "You are standing in my house," Alistair Blackwood said, "with your hand on the wrist of a woman in my employ, and you will explain yourself, Mr. Crane, or you will explain yourself to a magistrate. I find I have very little patience remaining for the first option." It was, Nell understood much later, the moment everything she had spent a year building toward either succeeded or came apart entirely, and she had no way, standing in that cold room with her father's letter crushed against her chest, of knowing which it would be. Alistair had not gone looking for trouble that night. He had gone looking for a book he did not particularly want, in truth, chiefly because sleep had refused him, and the house was quiet, and he had learned, over 3 years of owning it, that walking its corridors after dark settled something in him that daylight rarely managed. He had not expected to hear voices from the old nursery, a room he had scarcely entered since buying the place. He certainly had not expected to find Josiah Crane's hand locked around the wrist of his aunt's quiet, watchful companion, in a room full of ghosts neither of them, apparently, had told him about. He had known for some weeks now that there was more to Nell Farrow than a modest reference and a plain gray dress. He had told himself it was not his business. A man who had spent a decade building a fortune out of nothing but stubbornness had little patience for prying into other people's carefully guarded pasts, having guarded his own rather fiercely for most of his life. But watching her now, straight-backed and unflinching under Crane's grip, holding 2 old letters against her chest as though they were the only solid thing left in the world, he understood, with the particular unhurried clarity that had served him well in every difficult negotiation of his adult life, that whatever this was, it was not small, and it was not going to remain hidden much longer, and he found that he did not want it to. "Explain," he said again, "or leave my house tonight and never return to it." It was Nell who explained. She did it plainly, without weeping, standing very straight in the middle of the old nursery with the 2 letters held out at last, not to Crane but to the Duke, because she had understood in the space of a single held breath that she would rather trust this quiet, watchful stranger with the truth than spend 1 more year carrying it alone. She told him her name. She told him whose daughter she was, and whose house this had been, and what had been done to her in it 15 years before. She told him about the reference that was a lie, and the year that had led her back here, and the letter she had just found behind a nursery panel, where a dead woman had hidden it for a frightened child who had not, in the end, entirely failed her. Alistair Blackwood listened to all of it without once interrupting, his face giving away nothing beyond a stillness that had, by the end, become something closer to quiet fury directed entirely at the man still standing, cornered and increasingly desperate, by the nursery door. "You sold me a stolen house," he said to Crane when she had finished, in a voice gone very soft and very dangerous. "You understand that I will not let that stand. The sale was legal. The sale," Alistair said, "was built on a forged will and a lie told to cover the disappearance of a child, and you will have the extraordinary privilege of explaining both to a magistrate before this week is out, Mr. Crane, or I will make certain that every door in this county closes to you before you reach the end of it." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Mrs. Selby, fetch 2 footmen, and see that Mr. Crane is shown to a room and does not leave it until morning, when I will have sent for the magistrate myself." Josiah Crane went, in the end, without further struggle, because there was nothing left to struggle for, and because something in the Duke's stillness had made plain that the alternative would be considerably worse than a locked room and an unpleasant morning. When the door had closed behind him, and the sound of footsteps had faded down the passage, Alistair turned back to Nell, who stood exactly where she had stood through the whole of it, the letters no longer clutched but held loosely now, as though some enormous weight had finally been set down. "Eleanor Winslow," he said, testing the name, and something in the way he said it, carefully as though it deserved care, undid the last of her composure more thoroughly than Crane's cruelty ever had. "I should have told you," she said, "from the first day. I meant to find the letter and go, and never trouble you with any of it. And instead you stayed a month in my house under a false name, searching my nursery in the dark for proof that the ground under both our feet was built on a lie." He did not sound angry, though she had braced for it. He sounded, if anything, faintly and reluctantly amused, in the manner of a man recalculating a great many small observations that had at last resolved into a shape that made sense. "You knew the dog's name. You knew the 3rd book on the 2nd shelf. You went to the rose garden without a single wrong turning." "I grew up here," she said simply. "I have never stopped knowing it." "No," he agreed, looking around the small, cold nursery. At the shelf, the loose panel still hanging open, the faded paper on the walls that must once have been chosen for a child who was, he understood now, standing in front of him, "I don't imagine you have." The weeks that followed were not, in the end, weeks of drama, so much as weeks of quiet, unglamorous work, solicitors, depositions, a magistrate who examined the two letters with the deliberate gravity of a man who understood exactly how much they were worth, and a village that had known the old Earl's daughter as a small girl and had no difficulty at all recognizing the grown woman who returned, publicly and under her own name, to see justice done. Josiah Crane's protests dissolved rapidly once Hannah's testimony was set beside her own careful record-keeping. For Hannah, it emerged, had also left behind, in the keeping of the old vicar, a sealed account written the year Nell was sent away, in case the girl or the truth should ever return. Crane did not go to prison, in the end. The law was gentler to men of his standing than justice might have wished, but he left the county in disgrace, his fortune much reduced by the settlement Nell's solicitors extracted from him, and did not return. Alderleigh Hall remained, by every legal document that mattered, the Duke's own property, bought fairly, if unknowingly, from a fraud he had not committed, and no court in the land was inclined to strip a man of an estate he had purchased in good faith. Eleanor did not ask him to. What she asked for, and received without argument, was her name restored in the parish register, her father's true will entered into the county record beside the forged one that had stood so long unchallenged, and a settlement, wrung from Crane's diminished fortune, sufficient to make her, for the first time in 15 years, a woman who did not have to depend on anyone's charity for her next meal. She might have left then. She very nearly did. She had, after all, only ever meant to find the letter and go. But there was the small matter of a library with green curtains, and a worn patch on the rug, and a dog named Wren who had taken to following her everywhere, with the devoted stubbornness of an animal who had decided on instinct that she belonged to him. And there was the Duke himself, who had taken, in the months since that night in the nursery, to seeking her out in the evenings, not to discuss the settlement, which by autumn required very little discussing, but simply to sit with her in the library while Lady Osgood dozed by the fire, and talk, slowly, about nothing of consequence, in the manner of two people who had each spent a great many years learning not to need anyone, and were cautiously unlearning it together. "You could have your own house," he told her once, in October, a year almost to the day since she had first arrived under a false name. "Anywhere you liked. You have the means now." "I know," she said, "and yet you're still here." "I grew up in this house," she said, watching the fire rather than him, because it was easier to say difficult true things to a fire than to a man's face. "I lost it once, in the worst way a person can lose a thing. I find I am not in any hurry to lose it a second time, if I have any choice in the matter." He was quiet for a moment. In the particular way she had learned meant he was choosing his next words with unusual care. "You would have to marry its owner, in that case," he said at last, "if you wish to stay in it as more than a companion to my aunt for the rest of your days. I understand it is not a common arrangement. A duke marrying the daughter of the house he happened to buy. But I find I have never much cared what was common, and I have come, over the course of this year, to care a great deal about you." Eleanor Winslow. For she was Eleanor now, fully and only Eleanor, the last traces of Nell Farrow surrendered along with the false reference she had burned, unceremoniously, in this very fireplace the week the settlement was signed. Looked at him for a long moment, and found that the answer had been sitting quietly in her for rather longer than she had let herself notice. "Yes," she said, "I think I would like that very much." They were married in the spring, in the small stone church where her father and his father before him had been christened, with Lady Osgood installed in the front pew, loudly informing anyone who would listen that she had known it, would come to this since the third week, when the new companion had gone straight to the third book on the second shelf, without once glancing about her, and no one had believed her. The portrait of the girl in the blue dress still hangs on the landing at Alderleigh Hall. Beside it now hangs another, commissioned that same spring, at Alistair's quiet insistence, of a woman grown, standing in the same rose garden, her hand resting not against the sun but on the collar of an old gray-muzzled dog, her own name painted small and clear on a brass plate beneath it, where anyone climbing the stairs might read it and know, without needing to be told twice, exactly whose house this had always been.